It had been 3 long days since my husband had left for a business trip, and the house felt unusually silent. The air was thick with an unsettling calm, as if the walls themselves were holding their breath. My 2 sons, Liam and Charles, were home with me, but their presence didn't fill the void left by their father. Liam, at 33, was the responsible one. He had always been mature beyond his years, a steadfast rock in our family. With a successful career in finance, he took charge, ensuring everything ran smoothly while managing his own life with impressive diligence. He had a way of making even the most mundane chores feel manageable, often lightening the atmosphere with his dry humour. But Charles was different. At just 21, he was still figuring out who he was, navigating the tumultuous waters of young adulthood. His journey was marked by uncertainty and exploration, evident in the way he carried himself, sometimes confident, sometimes unsure. That morning, I couldn't help but notice how much Charles had changed recently. He had just turned 21, and it felt like overnight he had transformed into this strikingly attractive young man. His body had become toned and athletic from countless hours spent at the gym, and he walked with a newfound confidence, his shoulders broad and his posture straight. I had always seen him as my little boy, but now I was starting to see him as a man who was undeniably appealing in ways I never expected. It was shocking, really. I had been so wrapped up in my daily routines, taking care of the house and my family, that I hadn't noticed how quickly he had grown. One minute he was my sweet, awkward child. The next, he stood before me radiating an energy that made it hard to focus on anything else. I caught myself glancing at him more often than I intended, my heart racing at the realization of how much he had developed, not just physically, but emotionally too. While Liam went about his usual business, helping me with chores and checking in, Charles seemed to linger a little longer in my space. His playful banter carried an undercurrent of something else, something charged that made me uneasy yet excited at the same time. I didn't want to admit it, but there was a pull between us that I couldn't ignore. It felt as if my husband's absence had created a void that Charles was unwittingly trying to fill. I found myself both fascinated and terrified by that notion. As the day wore on, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had shifted in our dynamic. Charles was no longer just my son. He was a young man standing on the precipice of adulthood, filled with desires and thoughts that I wasn't prepared to confront. The sun hung low in the sky, casting warm golden rays through the kitchen window as we prepared lunch together. I watched him chop vegetables, muscles flexing under his t-shirt, and for a brief moment, I found myself lost in thought. I admired how capable he had become and how much he had taken on in his life recently. Still, there was a line I was afraid we might cross. It sent shivers down my spine, both thrilling and disconcerting at once. I wanted to guide him and protect him, yet I could sense the electricity in the air, the unsaid words hanging between us like an uninvited guest at our table. The day had only just begun, and already the tension felt almost unbearable. The next day dawned with an unsettling brightness that seemed to amplify everything. The anticipation bubbling beneath the surface of our interactions felt almost tangible. My husband was still away, and as I sat in the kitchen sipping my coffee that morning, I could feel a strange sense of expectation lingering in the air. Liam had already left for work, leaving just Charles and me alone in this house that now felt both familiar and foreign at once. It felt oddly quiet, as if the walls were eavesdropping on our unspoken thoughts swirling between us. Charles had made plans to spend the afternoon with friends, but something about the way he lingered around the house made me think he wasn't quite ready to leave just yet. I found him lounging on the couch, a video game controller in his hands, but his focus seemed to drift. Every now and then, he would glance over at me, a flicker of something in his eyes that I couldn't quite place. My heart raced whenever our eyes met, a magnetic pull that sent shivers down my spine. As I moved about the kitchen, cleaning up from breakfast, I caught Charles watching me. He leaned back against the couch, his gaze intense, almost studying me. There was an intensity in his stare that made my skin tingle, and I had to remind myself that he was still my son, no matter how different things felt. I couldn't shake the thought that he was starting to see me as more than just his mother. and it made me feel both excited and terrified. "Hey, Mom, do you want to play a game?" he asked, his voice casual, but there was an undertone that hinted at something deeper. I hesitated for a moment, the invitation hanging in the air like a dare. Part of me wanted to dismiss him, to keep things normal and simple, but another part of me, the part that had been electrified by his presence, wanted to say yes. I could feel the tug of war happening inside me. "Maybe later," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. I turned away, busying myself with dishes to hide the heat creeping up my cheeks. I felt his gaze linger, and it was as if the air had thickened around us. I could sense him shifting, and when I finally dared to look back at him, he was standing and moving toward me with a confidence that took my breath away. "Mom," he said, his tone serious now. "Can we talk?" The words hung heavy in the air. I nodded slowly, the knot in my stomach tightening. He moved closer, and I could feel the heat radiating off him, a physical reminder of how he had transformed into this incredibly attractive man. It was overwhelming, and I found myself at a loss for words. He stopped just a few feet away, his eyes searching mine for something, but I didn't know what to give him. "I've been thinking a lot about us, about how things have changed," he said, his voice low. "It feels different between us, you know?" My breath caught in my throat. I was scared, terrified of where this conversation might lead, but I also felt drawn to him, an inexplicable connection that pulled me in. "I know it's strange, but I can't help how I feel," he continued, stepping even closer and closing the distance between us. My heart raced as he reached out and brushed his fingertips against my arm. The touch sent a jolt through me. It was innocent enough, but the way he looked at me, the way his breath caught in his throat, ignited something inside me that I had never allowed myself to acknowledge. "Charles," I started, my voice trembling. I could feel the tension tightening around us like a coiled spring. "This isn't right. We have to be careful." The words spilled out desperately, as if trying to create some boundary between us. Yet deep down, I could feel a part of me wanting to give in, to explore the connection that had unexpectedly blossomed between us. He paused for a moment. For a brief instant, I saw a flicker of disappointment in his eyes. "I just thought maybe we could be more than what we are," he admitted softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't want to hide how I feel anymore." My heart raced, caught in a whirlwind of emotions that I struggled to process. The line between mother and son was blurring, and it was terrifying to confront. "I love you, Charles, but you're my son," I managed to say, hoping to instill some sense of normalcy back into our dynamic. "We can't cross that line. It's not right." But as I spoke, I realized how flimsy my own boundaries felt. The tension between us was thick, and I could see the conflict in his eyes. He wanted me, but he also wanted to respect me. I could feel the struggle between us, a battle of desires that neither of us knew how to navigate. The next day was heavy with the silence that lingered after yesterday's conversation. My husband was still away, and the tension with Charles felt like a thunderstorm brewing on the horizon. I focused on lunch, trying to push thoughts of him aside and concentrate on preparing a simple meal. When Liam returned home early, relief washed over me, but it was quickly replaced by the weight of Charles's presence in the room. Liam chatted animatedly about his day, and I tried to engage about, but Charles's nearness was magnetic, an invisible thread drawing me closer to him. When Charles reached for a snack, our arms brushed against each other, sending an involuntary jolt through me. It was wrong, but it felt so right. My heart raced as Liam stepped out for a call, leaving me alone with Charles. "Mom, can we talk?" he asked, urgency threading through his voice. Panic shot through me at his words. I wanted to deny him, to push away the feelings swirling inside me, but he was so close, his presence enveloping me like a warm blanket, and I could feel the air crackling between us. "Please hear me out. I can't pretend anymore," he said, desperation glimmering in his eyes. "Charles, we can't," I started, but he stepped closer, intensity radiating off him like heat from a flame. "This doesn't have to be wrong." As the evening wore on, I tried to shake off the unsettling feelings that clung to me like a fog refusing to lift. Dinner became an exercise in normalcy. I wanted to focus on Liam's stories from work and keep the conversation light and airy. Yet my mind kept drifting back to Charles. The tension from earlier still palpable, as if the air itself held its breath, waiting for something to break. After dinner, I suggested a movie in hopes of distracting us from the charged atmosphere that lingered in the room. Liam agreed enthusiastically while Charles remained quiet, his gaze fixed on me like a spotlight illuminating my every thought and feeling. I settled onto the couch, trying to act nonchalant as Charles chose to sit right beside me. The couch felt smaller than it ever had before. With each passing moment, I could feel warmth radiating from him, a magnetic pull I fought desperately to resist. As the movie played on in the background, I felt Charles's eyes on me, studying me with an intensity that made my heart race faster than ever before. Every time I laughed or shifted in my seat, I could sense his attention sharpening like an arrow ready to fly. It was unnerving, yet intoxicating all at once. I couldn't ignore how much he had changed. How this young man beside me was not just my son, but someone who had grown into an incredibly attractive individual, both physically and emotionally compelling. "Mom," he said softly, his voice cutting through the dim light of the screen like a whisper carried on the wind. "I can't stop thinking about yesterday." My breath caught in my throat as I held it tight. This conversation was headed somewhere dangerous and uncharted territory for both of us. What if we explored this, whatever it is between us, just a little? I turned to face him fully now, my heart pounding in my chest as if trying to escape its confines. "Charles," I replied firmly but gently, "we can't. You know this isn't right. You're my son." But even as those words left my lips, a part of me longed to say yes, to let myself fall into this moment and explore what lay beneath the surface of our connection. His expression was earnest and vulnerable. He searched mine for a flicker of hope, a signal that maybe I felt the same way he did. The film continued playing behind us like white noise. My pulse quickened as Charles moved just a little closer, the distance between us dwindling. I could smell his cologne, something fresh and clean, and it sent shivers down my spine. My instincts screamed at me to pull away, but my body was betraying me, caught up in the heady rush of emotion and attraction. "Mom, please," he said, his eyes pleading with an intensity that made my heart race. "I feel something real here, something that could be more than just mother and son." His honesty made me dizzy. I didn't want to hurt him, but I also couldn't shake the reality of our situation. The depth of his gaze was both thrilling and terrifying. In that moment, I knew I had to set a boundary, but it felt like trying to push back against a rising tide. I needed to tread carefully to protect us both from the dangerously thin ice we were walking on. Taking a deep breath, I steadied myself. "We need to talk about this, Charles. Not here, not now. I don't want to hurt you, but we can't ignore the line we're crossing." As the credits rolled on the movie, a mix of relief and anxiety washed over me. I had managed to redirect the conversation, but I could feel the unresolved tension hanging between us, thick and unyielding. How do you tell your son that you love him, but not in the way he wanted? How do you maintain the bond while establishing boundaries that seemed to be slipping through my fingers? The night felt heavier, charged with an energy I wasn't ready to confront. But I knew we had to find a way through this maze together. That night, I barely slept. Thoughts raced through my mind like a runaway train. Charles's words echoed in the quiet of my bedroom, relentless and haunting. I tossed and turned, trying to convince myself that it was just a phase he was going through, a misguided infatuation that would fade with time. But deep down, I knew it was more complicated than that. The intensity of our connection had shifted, and it was impossible to ignore. The following morning, I decided to approach the day with a sense of normalcy. I put on my favorite sweater and made a big breakfast, hoping the aroma of bacon and eggs would lift the heavy atmosphere that had settled in our home. Liam came down first, still half asleep, and smiled as he dug into the food. "This is just what I needed, Mom. You always know how to make everything better," he said, and for a moment I felt a sense of relief wash over me. I needed to cling to these moments of normality. As Charles came down, his expression was unreadable, a mask hiding whatever turmoil lay beneath. He caught my eye briefly, and I could feel the weight of everything unspoken hanging between us like a thick fog. "Hey, I made breakfast," I said, trying to keep my tone light despite the tremor in my voice betraying my anxiety. I needed to get through this day without addressing what had happened, at least until I could figure out what to do next. Liam chatted about his plans for the day, completely unaware of the tension lurking beneath the surface. Charles remained quiet at the table, pushing his food around his plate with an absent-mindedness that broke my heart. He had always been such a lively, animated kid, full of energy and mischief, but now there was a shadow over him that I couldn't quite understand. After breakfast, I suggested we take a walk around the neighborhood, hoping the fresh air would clear our heads and ease some of the tension between us. As we strolled along familiar streets lined with autumn leaves, I could sense Charles's energy fluctuating like a flickering light bulb. He'd glance at me briefly before looking away again, as if wrestling with some internal battle. I decided it was time to address things, but I also needed to tread carefully. "Charles," I began, my heart pounding as we walked. "I know yesterday was complicated." He stopped, turning to face me, the sun catching the intensity in his eyes. "Mom, I don't want to pretend like this doesn't matter. I can't just brush it aside." I took a deep breath, my heart racing. "I get that, but we need to set some boundaries. I love you and I always will, but this, what you're feeling, it's not something we can act on. I'm your mother and this is our family." His expression faltered, disappointment flashing across his face like a storm cloud gathering. "But why? Why can't we just explore this? It doesn't feel wrong to me." "Mom, it feels right." "I know it feels right, Charles," I replied softly, trying to convey the weight of my words. "But we have to think about the bigger picture. I don't want to ruin what we have. I don't want to hurt you, but crossing this line could change everything." He stepped back, frustration evident in his posture as he ran a hand through his hair. "You're making it sound like I'm some kind of freak. I just want to understand why it feels like this." I reached out instinctively, wanting to comfort him, but I knew better than to cross that boundary again. "You're not a freak, Charles. You're growing up, and sometimes those feelings get confused. It's natural, but that doesn't mean we have to act on them." We stood in silence, the distance between us palpable and heavy with unspoken emotions, filled with things neither of us wanted to name. My heart broke a little more with every second we lingered in that moment, realizing how complicated love can be. "Let's just take some time, okay? Time to think about what this means for both of us. I promise you I'll always be here for you, no matter what." He nodded slowly, but the hurt in his eyes was unmistakable. I wanted to reach out and bridge that gap between us, but I couldn't. Not now, not when everything felt so fragile. We resumed our walk, but the air was thick with tension, the unspoken words swirling around us like an ominous cloud, reminding me of the complexities of love and the lines we were desperately trying to navigate. I knew we needed to find a resolution eventually, but the path forward felt more uncertain than ever. The tension from our conversation lingered in the air like a heavy fog. That evening, as the sun began to set and cast a warm glow over our home, I knew we needed to have another conversation. The day had passed in a haze. Each moment dragged as I replayed our earlier exchanges in my mind like an endless loop. The weight of unspoken words pressed heavily on my chest. Charles had retreated into himself, spending most of the day in his room, while Liam filled the space with his innocent chatter, oblivious to the storm brewing between his brother and me. I could see concern etched on Liam's face whenever he glanced at Charles's closed door. My heart ached for both of them. I didn't want this situation to shatter our family. I wanted us to remain whole. But how? As the clock ticked on relentlessly, I gathered my courage and made my way to Charles's room, knocking softly on the door. "Hey, Charles, can I come in?" A moment of silence passed before I heard him mumble quietly, "Yeah." I opened the door and stepped inside. The room was dimly lit and cluttered with remnants of his life, a stark contrast to the turmoil brewing within me. Charles sat on the edge of his bed with his head bowed low, lost in thought as if grappling with emotions too complex for words. The sight broke my heart. "Charles," I started, my voice barely above a whisper. "I know today was rough. I just want to talk about it some more, if you're up for it." He nodded slowly but didn't look up, his gaze fixed on the floor as if searching for answers in the carpet fibers. I took a seat beside him, trying to close the gap between us, both physically and emotionally. "I've been thinking about what you said about feelings and all that," I continued, my heart heavy with the weight of our conversation. "It's hard for me too. You're not just my son. You're a person with your own thoughts and desires. And I get that." Finally, he looked at me, his blue eyes searching mine for understanding. "Mom, it just feels so real, you know? Like something I can't ignore. Why can't we just try to figure it out together?" I took a deep breath, weighing my words carefully. "No, it's not about pretending. It's about recognizing that some lines are better left uncrossed. I want you to grow and explore your feelings, but I also want you to understand the consequences of those feelings." I paused, gathering my thoughts like scattered leaves in a breeze. "How about this? Let's agree to talk about these feelings openly, but also set boundaries for ourselves. I think that's the healthiest way to navigate this." Charles sighed heavily, running a hand through his hair in frustration as he shifted his weight on the bed. "So we just talk about it? What's the point of that? I want more than just words." "I know," I replied softly, my heart aching at his longing for something deeper. "But right now, we have to prioritize what we already have. We need to keep the foundation of our family strong, and that means making tough decisions. It doesn't mean your feelings are invalid. It just means we need to protect our bond as mother and son first." He leaned back against the wall, the tension in his shoulders easing slightly as he absorbed my words. "I guess I can see where you're coming from, but it still hurts. It feels unfair." "It is unfair," I admitted, tears brimming in my eyes as the reality of our situation washed over me like a cold wave. Life doesn't always deal us the cards we want, but what we have is special, Charles. And I want to make sure it stays that way. We can work through this together, but it requires trust and respect for our roles in each other's lives. Finally, he nodded, though I could tell he was still processing everything, his expression a mix of confusion and longing. "I just want to feel like I'm not alone in this. Because, Charles," I continued gently, "I believe that love takes many forms. What you're feeling is intense. I won't deny that. But as your mother, I have to protect both you and myself from crossing lines that could destroy what we have. You mean the world to me, and I don't want to complicate our relationship in a way that could lead to regret." The disappointment in his eyes was palpable, a punch to my gut that left me reeling. "So that's it? We just pretend like this didn't happen? Like I didn't just bare my soul to you?" "You're not alone," I reassured him, reaching out to squeeze his hand gently, stopping just short of crossing that boundary again. "We're in this together, and I promise to always be here to listen no matter how messy things get. But let's be careful and respectful of what we have. It's worth it." As the night settled around us like a soft blanket, I felt a glimmer of hope flickering within me. Though the path ahead was uncertain and fraught with challenges, we had made a decision to face our struggles together rather than apart. Love, I realized, was not just about passion. It was also about understanding boundaries and, above all, the commitment to nurture the bond we shared as a family. I could only hope that this was the first step toward healing, even if it meant navigating the rough waters of our emotions together. Thank you for listening. Please share your thoughts, like this video if you found it helpful, and subscribe for more. I need to know I'm not alone. Sometimes the biggest betrayals aren't the ones we commit against others, but the ones we commit against ourselves.